Think with me for a moment. Have you ever felt that something inside you is broken, that no matter how hard you try, what really matters is never enough? Have you ever felt lonely in a crowd? Anxiety in your chest even when everything is fine? If so, get ready. This is not just any story. It's your story. And it's time to change the ending. Life has a peculiar way of teaching us. It throws us into situations that, at first glance, seem random, but which are in fact a manifestation of what is most deeply rooted within us. Have you ever wondered why you act a certain way in a specific situation, even when your conscious mind screams to do the opposite? Or why that fear that paralyzes you seems completely irrational, but still it dominates you completely? What is this invisible force that operates behind the scenes of your life, sabotaging your relationships, your career, your peace of mind? There is a lie that you have accepted as truth. A lie that was not told by anyone but was learned in silence. Kyle felt this way. He looked at his life, the modern apartment, the car in the garage, the professional success, and felt empty. That emptiness was not a new feeling. It was an old acquaintance, a ghost that had haunted him for as long as he could remember. He felt like a house with an invisible crack in the foundation. On the outside, it looked solid, but on the inside, he felt like he could collapse at any moment. How many times have you felt this way? As if you were living a life that seems perfect to others, but on the inside, you are in ruins. Kale's story does not begin with a great trauma, but with a series of small wounds. The subtle rejection at school, the disinterest of parents who were always busy, the mean jokes of colleagues about his appearance. Each of these experiences by themselves could be considered insignificant, but together, they became the mortar for a core belief. I'm not good enough. This belief became the lens through which he saw the world. He was not worthy of love. He was not worthy of success. He was an imposter. Have you ever looked at your own life through a lens like this? Have you ever felt that what others see in you is a farce, and that at any moment someone will discover the truth? This feeling, this belief manifested in Kale's life in surprising ways. At work, he always tried 3 times as hard to prove his worth, but never celebrated his achievements, fearing they would be taken from him at any moment. In relationships, he constantly sought the approval of others, but fled from true intimacy, afraid of being seen for who he really was and being rejected. He became a master of self-sabotage, creating invisible barriers that protected him from a pain he had already felt, that of rejection and devaluation. Have you ever found yourself doing something that deep down you know will hurt you, but you do it anyway? Because the familiar pain is more comfortable than the uncertainty of the unknown. What Kale didn't know was that this belief, this "I'm not good enough," was a lie. Not a deliberate lie, but a mistaken conclusion drawn by a child trying to make sense of the world. A child who did not have the emotional tools to process rejection and abandonment, and so decided that it was their fault. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches us that our core beliefs are formed by a kind of mental equation, where the child takes a fact, "I was rejected," and interprets it with a maladaptive conclusion. "This happened because I am not loved," turning the event into an absolute truth. Kale became the man he is today, not because of what happened to him, but because of what he believed about himself. And this is our starting point. We are not going to talk about what hurt you. We are going to talk about the story you created about your pain. The pain is a fact, but the narrative that surrounds it is a choice we often made in childhood. Kale, our protagonist, is about to discover that to free himself from his past, he does not need to erase his memories, but to rewrite the story they tell. The journey begins not with a step, but with the willingness to question what you have always considered unquestionable. And for that, he will need to face the greatest guardian of his beliefs, the one who is lurking, ready to sabotage every small step towards freedom. Kale's journey is one of return, a return to that invisible battlefield where the truth was lost. Have you ever noticed how your mind, in moments of anxiety, seems like a time machine, always pulling you back to the same scene, the same feeling? Kale felt this every time he had to speak in public or present an idea at work. No matter how prepared he was, no matter how well he knew the content by heart, an inner voice would whisper, "What if they realize you're a fraud? What if they laugh at you like they did when you were little?" This is our mind's function, to protect us. But what happens when the protection mechanism becomes the prison itself? A child's mind that has suffered rejection learns that vulnerability is dangerous. It creates a protective barrier, a comfort zone that in reality is a cage. Kyle felt safe in anonymity, in invisibility. Living in the shadows was painful, but it was a kind of pain he knew. The pain of exposure was an abyss of terror, and because of that, he preferred the familiar suffering to the uncertainty of freedom. Have you ever found yourself refusing an incredible opportunity, sabotaging a promising relationship, simply because the next step, the step into the unknown, was too terrifying? It's your own security system working against you. For Kyle, the first step towards change was not a heroic act, but a small, almost imperceptible gesture of rebellion. He enrolled in a public speaking course. His mind screamed, "Don't do it." But something in his spirit, a fragment of himself that still believed in his potential, pushed him to click that enrollment button. It was the first direct confrontation with his limiting belief. The inner voice became a roar, flooding him with cold sweat and shivers. But he didn't stop. True courage, he was learning, is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. An ancient parable tells the story of a monk who feared crossing a bamboo bridge over a turbulent river. The bridge was narrow and swayed in the wind. Instead of fighting the fear, the monk decided that each step would be a prayer. With each sway of the bridge, he felt the panic, but he didn't identify with it. He just kept praying, breathing, and walking. He reached the other side not because the fear disappeared, but because he allowed the fear to be present while he moved forward. How many times have you allowed the voice of fear to tell you to stop? What would happen if you listened to it, but kept going anyway? Kyle's resistance was strong. The day of the first public speaking class arrived, and his body refused to go. His throat closed up, his legs trembled, a throbbing headache set in. He stayed home looking at the computer screen, feeling the immediate relief of his belief's victory. I'm not capable. I don't need approval, this isn't for me. But the relief lasted only for an instant, being quickly replaced by a sense of defeat and regret. The limiting belief protects you from an imaginary pain, but it deprives you of real joy and fulfillment. Gradual exposure, as CBT teaches us, is not about forcing yourself to jump into the abyss, but about allowing yourself to look at it, one step at a time. Kyle's failure to go to class was not a failure of therapy, but a revelation of the strength of his protection system. He realized he needed a different approach, not to fight the fear, but to understand it. The journey of healing is not a war, but a conversation with your pain. Healing begins when you understand that your core belief is not you. It's just a story you learned. Kyle, looking at the reflection of his own fear, knew he needed to confront the story of the boy who thought he wasn't good enough. The battle was not against the world, but against the narrative he had about the world. And to win it, he would need an unusual weapon: vulnerability. The path to healing is a labyrinth, and Kyle was about to discover that sometimes the way out is to go in even deeper. Giving up on the public speaking class was not a period, but a comma. That act of surrender led him to a revelation. His fight was not against the stage or the people, but against the boy who still lived inside him. That frightened boy who would huddle with his hands on his face and his body curled up in fear didn't need lectures, he needed a hug. And Kyle, for the first time, allowed himself to feel that compassion for himself. How many times have you judged yourself for not being strong enough, when what you really needed was a little tenderness? Kyle, motivated by this new understanding, decided to return to the office where the "I'm not good enough" belief manifested most clearly. He observed like a scientist his own reactions. When his boss praised his work, the automatic response was to look away, say it was nothing, and feel uncomfortable. That was the voice of the wounded child, fearing that the praise was a trap. He began to practice what therapists call belief resignification. Instead of reacting, he would pause and observe the thought, "I don't deserve this praise." Then, he would question it. Is this thought really true? What is the evidence for it? The evidence his mind provided was always the same: a memory of a past mistake, a negative comment from years ago. But he was learning that a single negative piece of evidence does not nullify an ocean of positive evidence. Resignifying a belief is like the parable of the river and the stone. The stone at the bottom of the river is an old and heavy belief that diverts the flow of water, your life, onto a predictable but narrow and painful path. You can't just pull the stone out, it's too deeply rooted. but you can start placing other stones' new beliefs around it. Slowly, the flow of the water diverts. The old belief is still there, but its power over the river diminishes. The river, your life, begins to follow a new, wider and freer course. Kyle started doing this. With every compliment that came, he forced himself to stop, look into the eyes of the one complimenting him and say, "Thank you. I'm glad you liked my work." It was a small act, but it was like placing a new stone in his river. It was the first time he allowed something positive to truly touch him. This practice of resignification was not a linear process. There were days when Kyle felt like a complete failure, days when the voice of the past was louder than any evidence of the present. But he continued. He was learning that change is not an event, but a process, a series of small daily choices. With every thank you, he said, every time he stopped to question his self-criticism, he was dismantling brick by brick the prison he had built for himself. He was becoming his own mentor. The real challenge, however, was yet to come. The resignification of beliefs is just the beginning. The next step, the true trial by fire, was to expose himself again. Not to his boss or his co-worker, but to himself. Because fear, he was discovering, wasn't the monster that lived under the bed. Fear was the guardian of the child he had been, whispering, "Stay here, it's safe. It's dangerous out there." To move forward, Kyle needed to do something he avoided at all costs, allow himself to be vulnerable and finally face the abyss. The first step to growth is awareness, and Kyle had already taken that step. The second and most challenging is action. He knew he needed to expose himself again, but this time it wouldn't be to prove his worth, but to confront the belief that he was a fraud. Kyle enrolled in a new public speaking class, but this time the motivation was different. It wasn't about pleasing others, but about freeing himself. The fear was still there and not in his throat, but the purpose was greater. Cognitive behavioral therapy suggests the technique of gradual exposure. For Kyle, this meant climbing small steps towards his fear. Instead of going straight to the main stage, he started with small groups, speaking in a low voice, asking simple questions. He felt the panic rise, but instead of running away, he focused on the physical sensation. The racing heart, the sweating hands. He realized that these sensations were just that, sensations. They were the body's response to fear, but they were not the fear itself. This distinction was crucial. He was learning to observe his emotions without drowning in them. Like that ancient parable of the fisherman caught in a storm. He can't stop the wind or the waves, but he can adjust the sails and the rudder. He is not in control of the storm, but he is in control of his response to it. Have you ever stopped to feel your anxiety without fighting it? Have you noticed that if you just observe it, without judgment, it loses a little of its strength? With each small victory, Kyle felt the "I'm not good enough" belief weaken. When he gave his first formal presentation in the course, he didn't seek perfection, but vulnerability. His voice trembled at first. His words got tangled, and for an instant, he felt the urge to run away. But instead he stopped, took a deep breath and said, "Sorry, I'm a little nervous." That simple and true phrase had a miraculous effect. The looks of judgment he expected turned into looks of empathy and understanding. He wasn't a fraud. He was a human being, and so were the people around him. That was the first time Kyle allowed himself to be imperfect and was accepted. And that acceptance, he realized, didn't come from outside but from within. It came from the act of accepting himself, of allowing himself to be flawed. Healing is a process of rewriting. The script your mind created in childhood, with the belief that you are not loved, is an old story. With each new action, each small act of courage, you are writing a new script. Kyle, the man who avoided the stage, became Kyle, the man who allowed himself to be seen. And that transformation, he was realizing, wasn't about becoming a different person, but about becoming who he always was, before the lie took over. Freedom is not the absence of pain, but the ability to live despite it, and to know that your story doesn't have a period yet. The next part of his journey will lead him to confront the origin of it all, the loneliness of the boy who once felt invisible. The resignification of a belief is a battle fought within us. But what about the origin of the enemy? For Kyle, the final battle was against his own memory, against the loneliness of the boy who felt abandoned. CBT tells us that often it's not the event itself that traumatizes us, but our interpretation of it. What for Kale was proof that he wasn't good enough to receive his parents' attention. For an adult was just the manifestation of overwhelmed and stressed parents. The pain was real, but the conclusion he drew from it was mistaken. To heal this wound, Kyle needed to do something he had avoided his whole life: go back to that place of pain and behave in a different way. He took an old photo of himself, a 7-year-old child standing in a corner alone. He placed the photo on his desk, and every morning he would look at it, not with pity, but with the tenderness the child deserved and that he had never received. He would look at the boy in the photo and say, "I see you, and you are safe now. You are enough." This was the most intimate and powerful exposure of all, the exposure of the adult Kale to the child Kale. How many times have you looked in the mirror and only seen your flaws, instead of seeing your most vulnerable and hurt self? This simple and profound practice of welcoming the inner child began to transform Kale from the inside out. Every time he talked to the boy in the photo, he was rewriting the script of the past. The scene of abandonment was no longer about "I'm not good enough," but about "my parents were busy, and I as a child misinterpreted the situation. Now as an adult, I am the person who is here to love and protect myself." The parable of the gardener and the seed teaches us that we cannot change the soil where the seed was planted, but we can take care of the plant that grew from it, watering it with compassion and removing the weeds of self-criticism. Kale's real trauma wasn't the rejection, but the loneliness he felt having to process it alone. He became the adult he needed when he was a child. He was realizing that the success he sought was not a career or a car, but the inner peace he so desired. Healing is not something that comes from outside, but something that blossoms from within. Kyle was in the middle of his labyrinth, but now he had a flashlight. The flashlight of self-compassion. He was on the way to getting out of the labyrinth, not by destroying the walls, but by finding himself in the center of it. The next part of Kyle's journey is about how he used this new vision to connect with the world in a way he never had before. Kyle's journey was no longer about fixing something broken, but about nurturing something that had been neglected. He was learning that healing is not an event, but a continuous process of self-compassion. With this new perspective, he dared to take a step that in the past would have been unthinkable. He sought connection. Kyle began to open up to people, not with the goal of seeking approval, but of sharing his humanity. He stopped protecting himself with an armor of silence and allowed himself to be vulnerable. One day, in a casual conversation with a co-worker, Kyle confessed that, despite his success, he felt deeply insecure. He expected a look of pity or judgment, but what he received was a compassionate smile and a, "I get it." And we always feel like imposters, don't we? That simple moment of recognition was a turning point. The belief that he was alone in his pain was undone. CBT teaches us that social validation is a powerful tool in re-signifying beliefs. When we see that other people share our fears and insecurities, the belief that we are abnormal or inadequate weakens. The parable of the island and the ocean illustrates this perfectly. The person who feels lonely is like an island, isolated and surrounded by a sea of fear. She sees other islands in the distance and envies them, thinking they are perfect. But when she dares to build a bridge, no matter how fragile, and walk towards another island, she discovers that all the islands are connected at the bottom of the ocean. Vulnerability is the bridge that connects us to each other and reveals to us that our loneliness is an illusion. Kale was building this bridge, one conversation at a time. With each new connection, he felt his armor dissolve. Vulnerability did not make him weaker, but stronger, more authentic. He was discovering that true intimacy is not about being perfect, but about being real. And the most surprising thing of all, he was starting to like who he was, the man he had spent years trying to hide. Kyle had not become a new person. He was the same man with the same story, but with a new meaning. The boy who felt lonely became the man who dared to connect. His journey, however, still had one last and crucial step. To close the cycle and free himself completely, he would need to make peace with the past and finally accept the story that shaped his life. The end of his journey would not be a destination, but a reconciliation. Reconciliation with the past does not mean forgetting it, but accepting it as part of who we are. For Kale, this meant making peace with the story of the boy who felt invisible. He was on the path to freeing himself, but the last step was the hardest, forgiving. Not others, but himself. Forgiving the boy for having created a mistaken story, and the adult for having sustained it for so long. He knew that the non-acceptance of his own story was the last prison. CBT teaches us that forgiveness is a process of freeing ourselves, not the other, from the prison of hurt. It is a conscious decision to let go of the narrative that we are victims of our past. Kale understood that by holding on to the story of his pain, he was unconsciously reliving it. He saw himself as a victim of his childhood, and this identity, however painful, was familiar and gave him a sense of purpose. However, it also prevented him from living in the present and creating a different future. The parable of the seed and the tree exemplifies this journey. The seed, our purest essence, can carry the marks of its origin, the stones and the dryness of the soil. But if it grows and becomes a strong tree, it does not deny the seed. It honors it, recognizing that the struggle to grow made it resilient. The tree does not focus on the hurt seed, but on its leaves, its fruits, the shade it offers. Kyle was transforming from a seed into a tree. He was accepting his origin, but focusing on his growth. And in this process, the old narrative of pain was replaced by a new narrative, that of resilience. He realized that the final healing was not the absence of scars, but the ability to look at them and tell a different story. The scar was no longer a symbol of shame, but a symbol of overcoming. Kale was finally free to be who he was, with all his imperfections and his history, without fear of judgment, because the greatest judgment had already been absolved by himself. Kyle was ready to move forward, to live the life he always wanted, not the one his beliefs allowed him to. He was ready for freedom, and it is at this point in liberation that the journey becomes a guide, not just for him, but for you too. In the last part of our journey, we will see how Kale's story connects with yours, and how you can apply these same principles to rewrite your own life. Kyle's journey, that of a man confronting the ghosts of his childhood, is not unique. In fact, it is the journey of all of us. The limiting beliefs we form in childhood, the story we tell ourselves about our pain, are the chains that keep us trapped. But freedom, as Kyle discovered, is not something you find, but something you create. It is the result of small acts of courage, vulnerability, and self-compassion. Throughout his journey, Kyle learned 3 essential truths that you can also apply to your life. The first is that fear is not an enemy, but a guide. It points to the wounds that need healing. Instead of running from it, Kyle allowed himself to feel it, and by doing so, he disarmed its power. The second truth is that vulnerability is not weakness, but the greatest source of strength. By allowing himself to be seen in his imperfection, Kyle discovered the connection and validation his soul so longed for. He reconnected with the world and, more importantly, with himself. And the third truth, the most crucial of all, is that you are the author of your own story. The story you inherited may be painful, but the story you tell from now on is yours to write. Kyle's life changed, not because the world around him changed, but because his narrative about it changed. He became the mentor he needed when he was a child. He looked at the frightened boy and welcomed him, and by doing so, he set himself free. And you, what is the story you have been telling yourself? What would happen if you rewrote it step by step starting today? Fear is a fact, but suffering is a choice. Freedom is in your control. Think of Kale's story not as something to be watched, but as an invitation to be lived. What is the first small step you will take towards your freedom? The journey begins now. And it, like all great journeys, ends at home inside you.